not today. This is where we stopped yesterday with practice time. So the two things you need to figure out is what's the short run impact on output and what should the Fed do with regards to money supply and interest rate. So here are your three scenarios. Think, practice. Yes, sir.
So I was looking at that AP book yesterday, and it has the aggregate.
The textbook?
No, the small one.
Oh.
It has the aggregate supply like horizontal, and then it goes up. Why?
Good question. I'll explain that when we're done with this chapter.
Okay. So I'm like, wait, this isn't like anything like what I thought it was.
Well, let's find out if they're right. happens to output when Congress cuts government spending?
Increases aggregate demand goes output.
Output decreases.
So what happens to aggregate demand?
It goes to the
Decreases.
The output.
Let's pull out the book and figure this out.
Which one's the one that?
What do you mean?
Where it would move along?
Government spending.
Or like where it would move along on the curve, not try to
Graduation speech. I want you to give a speech on good. You speak to
How is it?
Okay.
Do you guys get run and try every time you run?
David. How's that?
How do you get it?
yesterday?
You don't get it one time?
Case.
Why the long run?
Oh.
No,
I
that's
didn't have
why.
to do this.
You didn't have to. Jonathan?
Why the aggregate demand curve might shift.
Alright, listen up.
Shifts arising from changes in consumption.
Or investment.
Shifts arising from changes in investment. Shifts arising from changes in government purchases. Shifts arising from changes in net exports. Which I believe is what you tried to tell me yesterday. You were correct. So, which component of GDP changed? Government purchases G. It decreased, so aggregate demand decreases. Or component of GDP decreases, which is productivity, or output has decreased. So now, what should the Fed do?
Increase the money supply, drop interest rates.
Both increase the money supply and drop interest rates?
Well,
It does
it
the money
does the same
supply-
thing.
The money
If you-
supply,
If you shift the money supply, it drops interest rates.
Yeah.
Let's talk at the same time.
So which one do you want to do?
The money supply and the interest rates will fall.
Naturally, the interest
And
rates
what do
will
you want to do to the money supply?
You wanna
increase it.
Increase it.
I'm gonna increase the money supply.
Doesn't that decrease interest rates?
Yeah.
Increase
So,
it,
because
that's-
if you have more money in the market, the banks are more willing to like give it out to people, which makes the banks lower their interest rates because it's not as high.
In the
as-
short run, it increases the consumption.
So what if we graphed that?
It just moves aggregate demand back to where it was.
So how would you graph that? You would graph the two graphs side by side, right? What would we label this graph here?
R.
In the short run.
MD.
It will.
No.
Yeah, that's but that's long.
P.
I think so. I think we. In the
Y.
short run,
Oh, they both
The P and Y, you have your aggregate
Yeah,
demand, your long run aggregate.
It'd be YN,
But if that's
Isn't that on the other
YN.
side?
What's this what's this
That's the
label?
money
Long run
supply.
aggregate
That's money supply. Start investing.
No, that's long.
Oh, we're on the wrong graph.
Long run aggregate
That's
supply.
long run, yeah.
Oh wait,
Oh, right,
yeah,
yeah.
long run aggregate.
My point here is it doesn't matter which one you put on which side.
As long as they're not
This one's which one?
long run aggregate supply.
And then,
You have your
Aggregate
aggregate
demand.
or aggregate.
which way does that go?
Aggregate
That's
Demand
more
slows
slow.
down.
demand.
This way?
That's aggregate supply.
Aggregate demand.
AD.
Alright.
Short run
Upward
aggregate
slope.
supply. Slope upward from the origin.
Or do you want a short run aggregate supply on this?
Yeah.
Yeah,
You
let's
need one?
do it.
now.
You don't need one. Why would you put more than you actually
Okay, so what should we do over here?
Because it's more.
So you have your money supply.
Money supply.
What's money supply look like?
It's very
vertical
vertical.
line.
There's demand.
Money demand.
Slope.
Downward
What's that look
slope.
like?
Like
Downward slope. It's like aggregate
slope
demand.
down.
Okay. So like that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Alright. So when this happened, what'd we do?
We have to.
AG.
Shift AD to the
Increase the
left.
money.
Would you label the bottom end? That's just
probably just that.
It's a quantity of money.
So we move aggregate demand to the left, you said?
Yeah.
Which brings our price level down. Okay. And so then what did you want to do over here?
Shift money demand.
Increase the
Money supply.
Money supply, sorry.
Which,
increases consumption and eventually increases investment.
Which lowers interest rates.
The lower interest rates feeds better investment in the future.
But then
Which-
eventually it'll correct.
Because aggregate demand will bounce
which
back up.
ultimately will increase, increase the quantity of money demanded, right?
Yeah.
Which then increases investment, and we hope that I goes up as much as G came down, and that we eventually
Just go back.
push right back. In which case, what will the Fed do?
Decrease.
Decrease the money supply. It's a circle. It's the circle of money supply.
Yeah, it's
I'm
Wednesday.
tired.
Yeah, Wednesday might do this.
Did you guys finish before it rained yesterday?
Yeah.
But not before the winds picked up all day.
80. I'm sure it's 70.
Ooh, nice.
Don't you pay attention? Don't you follow golf Twitter?
I
What's
do
your PR?
follow golf Twitter.
So I do.
73 at Tiburon on a windy day.
No, we didn't play. That was from 2 days ago.
Oh.
But we
Where
just-
were you guys yesterday?
We just had practice.
Oh.
Yeah.
You're talking about practice?
We're talking about practice.
Oh, you say?
Yeah, what ball do you use?
Mosey.
You do use pro. So,
I'll
you
do it.
probably want
Graduation
pro max
speech.
Alright.
Probably not.
License.
Always.
Oh, good luck,
on a Callaway guy.
I don't know.
Why am
I don't know, but you can
I
try.
make fun of Callaway guys.
May I? You may.
Why?
That sounds.
Okay,
Dodgers and Callaway
so what happens to aggregate demand?
Increase.
What happens to output? So what do? Market's out of control.
Increase in money supply.
Sell
Increase in
bonds.
interest rates.
We sell Obama?
Sell bonds. Sell Obama, yeah, that's what we do.
We sell bonds. Selling bonds does what?
Decrease.
Doing what to aggregate demand?
Increase.
As a result of an increase in interest rates. More people want to save, fewer people want to invest.
Savings would go up.
I have an answer.
So, like, when people have more money, so like you're saying like there's like household wealth and you want to decrease that, and then
Because if you have people feeling like they're wealthy, then they're gonna go out and spend that money and they're going to drive prices up.
so then if people are like if the household wealth decreases, you want to increase that.
Yeah,
Increase.
it's a balancing act. It's like a teeter totter.
Can't argue
It's
that.
very much like a teeter
Don't
totter.
mention that.
They have the
And
same
then
effect, they're just different.
when you like
Oh, you're
increase
gonna
the money supply, the interest rate,
Graph it.
Probably investment.
When you slide the money supply to the right, don't look at me like that, graph it.
Very little.
Lauren wants to know what happens to the interest rate when you increase money supply.
Increase money supply.
Then you seem like your dad
On Wall Street?
So when we increase money supply, what happened to the interest rate, Lauren?
I like that.
decrease.
Yeah, graph it. You don't like graphing. You're gonna be a business major in college?
Morgan.
Hey, we don't know for sure yet.
Look
It's just
at
what
this
I'm
graph.
listed
The weed was making you.
as. Me, myself, and I.
That's what I thought I said too.
Alright. Hopefully they won't charge you tuition for all your personalities. She said me, myself, and I.
Me, myself, and Irene.
Not
Good movie.
not Jim Carrey's best.
In
Alright.
Deca, we do business and not the graphic.
Because DECA is just like college business required
I didn't
classes.
say it was, but I'm just saying.
You're gonna have to take econ in college.
That's why I'm
Your
very.
finance classes will require.
Hey, that could go so.
I'm gonna take it.
I'm not taking life.
Are you really?
You
really
seeds
seeds?
sunflower seeds?
Hey, what happens here?
Money's much.
No.
Everything changes. It's
It's
chaos.
just supply.
It's chaos.
That's quick to exist.
No, that's
So you
what
want
I'm saying.
to say
Short
short
run
run
is
supply.
decreasing, but if you prevent it,
What happens?
Short run aggregate supply decreases.
Oh.
You have an obstruction.
Output decreases.
no,
Jared says short run aggregate supply decreases.
Increases out.
Hayden says output decreases.
I just know
Yeah.
that's a fact for one.
Wait,
Because it's a shit. Input,
Dayton agreed, and now he's questioning himself.
like everything has.
would consumption
So
decrease at
yeah,
all?
that's a fine.
If we were buying
And
less
then the price.
gas, buying less cars, buying less things I use.
Oh, I get it.
But would government spending go up because they're now spending for the war?
Oil is like a typical input for.
It doesn't say that we're in the war. It says war is happening in the Middle East.
Yeah, just oil, just oil.
Yeah,
So-
government just- that's why I'm-
You can't assume an econ, you just know oil prices go up.
You only know these things.
Short run supply decreases.
It's not that far away.
Yes.
What happens to output?
Decreases.
So what do we do?
What do we
Increase the money
do?
supply.
We do what?
Increase the
Increase
money
the
supply.
supply.
Increase.
Boom. All right.
Then you-
I feel like you've got a decent grasp on this. So let's add more complicated things.
You can't do it by itself.
Always.
All right. The liquidity trap, and this is where we've been the past several years. See, when we use monetary policy, we stimulate aggregate demand by reducing the interest rate. We make money cheap. But there is a limit to how cheap you can make money, right? What is the minimum interest rate? 0. You make money free, right?
Oh, yeah, that'd be nice.
Okay, it's called liquidity trap when you get your interest rate down to 0. Because that means that there's nothing more you can do. No matter how much more you increase the money supply, money doesn't get cheaper. Never, never, never will you find a banker out on the street going, hey, here's $10, come take out a loan. They're never going to pay you interest to borrow money from them. That would be a negative interest rate. Not gonna happen. Hey, I tell you what, we'll loan you $100, you only pay us back 90. No, not. Banks are in business to make money. So we have definitely a liquidity trap. What that means then is what? What is useless to us when we enter the liquidity trap?
Saving money. Yeah.
What arrow in our quiver is useless? Its head has fallen off of the arrow shaft.
Money supply.
Monetary policy is now useless. Does us no good. Can't reduce interest rates, and that's the whole point of monetary policy. Wah, wah. We can make real interest rates negative. They can talk about expected inflation, which then makes real interest rates negative. Think about that. Real interest rate equals the nominal interest rate minus the expected rate of inflation. So if our interest rates are at 0 and we expect inflation to be 2%, what is our real interest rate? Bad news.
You got it.
All right. So it's not monetary policy, but they can still impact some change. What does giving us a negative real interest rate accomplish? Pretty much absolutely stops John Doe from putting any money in the bank. What's he gonna do with it?
Put in all in different form.
It's gonna spend it. We're gonna increase consumption, right? Which we hope will then increase inflation and get us to a point where we can reduce the money supply and get out of the liquidity trap. Which is exactly what the Fed is doing right now. They can still do some open market operation stuff where they deal with other kinds of debt, not just government bonds. And that is some of what they did when they got to the point where they had lowered interest rates so much by the time of the housing crash, and they were in a definite liquidity trap. All right. So now the other side, Congress. Fiscal policy is government spending and taxation. We have expansionary fiscal policy, which is where we want the economy to expand. Very good. Okay. We can do one of two things. We can shoot our arrow at one of two targets. We can what about spending or taxes? What do we do if we want expansionary fiscal policy?
Increase taxes.
Increase taxes?
Decrease.
Decrease taxes?
Increase government.
Increase government spending. That would get you expansionary fiscal policy. Aggregate demand would then shift to the right. What's the opposite of expansion?
Collapse.
Contraction.
Expansion.
Contractionary fiscal policy. What are we going to do with government spending? Decrease it. What are we going to do with taxes?
Increase.
Increase them. So Congress just gave us all a tax cut, right? That was part of what kind of fiscal policy?
Expansion.
Expansionary fiscal policy. And yet, what is the Fed doing at the same time? Increasing interest rates. Which does what? Decreases aggregate. So they're moving in opposite directions now.
Yeah, why they do
Well, aggregate demand may not change.
Congress is elected by the people. The Federal Reserve is appointed. So Congress is supposed to respond to the people. The Federal Reserve is supposed to do what they think is right. Federal Reserve plans long in advance. They have already told us they expect 2 more interest rate increases this year, right? What prompted the governmental tax cut?
Elections.
The election cycle this year. Who wants to be put back in Congress? The Republicans. Republicans campaign on fiscal conservatism, which would mean, theoretically, decreased government spending and decreased taxes and limiting the size of government. So they've given us some of that. The Fed has said, we initially planned for 2 interest rate increases, but now, since Congress went and did that, we're going to go for 3 more. Effect number 1 of fiscal policy is the multiplier effect. Government spending causes this. Government buys $20 billion of planes from Boeing. By the way, the budget deal did what to military spending? Oh, high spiked it to its highest levels ever, right? Massive increases in G. At the same time, we're cutting T. Definite expansionary fiscal policy, right? Okay? So Boeing's revenue increased by 20 billion when the government said we're going to buy 20 billion in planes. Okay? What does Boeing do with that revenue?
Give some of it to their employees.
Pay their employees, maybe they give out some wages or some bonuses.
Or they invest it back in their
They could invest it back into their company, where some of it definitely going, knowing that Boeing is publicly held.
shareholders.
Shareholders. Okay? Shareholders and employees are
Labor.
citizens
So they buy stuff.
who then take the money that they got in their dividends or in their increased wages and go out
And consume.
and take the kids to Disneyland. They eat out a few more times a week. They buy that new car. Buy that bass boat.
Ooh.
Make some repairs on the house. Okay? So then we end up with even more, because we had the increase in G, which increased aggregate demand. Now we have an increase in C, so we have multiplied the effect of the increased government spending. How many of you who currently have a job used to get an allowance from your parents, or used to get more money from them before you got a job? I maintain that them cutting your allowance off had a multiplier effect. Because now they're not just taking their money and giving it to you to go spend. They're keeping their own money, which means that they can spend it, and they have forced you to go earn your own money, which means you get to spend it. Multiplier effect. So I'm going to write a note to all your folks telling them, cut off the gravy train, we need expansionary fiscal policy at home. I'll explain the multiplier effect to them. Time to start looking for a job, guys. Need to improve the economy. All right, let's look at it graphically. Lauren, you can avert your eyes. So what does that increase in aggregate demand look like graphically? It what?
Shift to the right.
Shift to the right.
Sure.
Okay. So that's the government spending. Now what about when Boeing spreads that 20 billion around? So what happens? Graphically. Shifts to the right again. Woo! Wee! It inevitably would be a little less than that. Yeah, some of the people are going to save it, but if they save it, where does it end up? Investment. If Boeing puts it into expanding a new plant, what does that count as? Right? So it's going to be pretty close, unless some of it gets invested overseas.
What if they just keep it in their
If they just bury it in mason jars in the backyard,
Yeah,
yeah, then we got a problem.
there we go.
All right. So the question is, and Davis just asked it, how big is that their multiplier effect? And the answer is it depends.
It depends.
Of course it depends, right? It depends upon how likely you are to spend what you've just done. So I go back to a question I've asked you before. You put on a spring jacket for the first time now that the weather's finally warm, put your hands in your pockets, and whoa, $20 bill.
Nice.
I'm totally spending.
Wow.
Never happened to me. Ever.
What you do with that $20 bill depends upon your marginal propensity to consume. Do you run and buy a pizza?
It's only $20.
Do
yeah.
you run to the bank? It's
Put it in
only
my
$20. Where's your threshold?
I don't know, if I reach in my pocket and I find $1,000 and be like,
like, okay, I'll put that in the bank.
Would you? How much of it would you just spend because you're just out of grant?
How
I
would,
wouldn't
why
spend
would
any
you,
of it.
why would you have a grant in a check?
That's what I'm saying, that's why.
So why is $20 worthless to you?
You know, $1,000.
Where's that difference?
I don't know.
Is it 30, is it 50? Would 50 go in the bank?
No.
50
100,
would go
yes.
there. 100 would go there.
Yeah.
What if it was in 520s? Would it matter what it was in?
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah,
The first thing I
Yeah.
do is, I like to
Go
fill up my car with gas.
MPC tells us the fraction that households save versus what they consume. MPC, marginal propensity to consume, how much of the extra money that they get are they going to save, how much are they going to spend? Marginal propensity to consume is more than just the $20 in your pocket. Dayton, you got a job? You get a 25-cent an hour raise. You spend all of that increased income.
No.
When's the last time you got a raise, Dave?
You asked me for.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I've never gotten a raise.
Never worked anywhere long enough?
No, I've worked at the same place for 2 years, but my dad won't give me a raise. He tells me that I'm good, cheap labor.
Makes sense.
Although I started at 10, so he counts that as my raise. He could have started me at 9.
Got it. Actually, is it a family business?
Yeah. He
Then
could have
you
not
didn't
paid.
have to pay
Yeah.
anything
He
at all.
paid me. He was like, "That's a good enough raise."
Yeah, it's pretty
Feed me
generous.
food.
Alright. So let's say you walk into work tomorrow and Dad says, been a good year, looks to be a better spring and summer, gonna pay you $10.50. How much of your current $10 an hour do you save?
All of it. My
Until he
dad won't
buys
let me
it.
spend any of it.
So your dad bought all those tacos?
No, that's just money my mom gives me sometimes.
Wow.
Wow, I wish I.
Are they looking for an older, more independent child to adopt?
He just well, okay, technically I spent half the money because I had to buy a car. So that
Alright,
counts.
you're killing me.
Who pays for the gas?
My dad pays for the gas because he doesn't want me to work during the school year, so he pays for my gas.
So that you can play Fortnite in class.
Yeah.
That's important.
Really lies.
I'm sending the link to this lecture to your dad, by the way. Alright, so if your marginal propensity to consume is 0.8, and you get an increase in your income of $100, you're going to spend $80 and save 20. We have a formula.
What was the point for asking me those questions? Did I give you the wrong answers?
Yes, you gave me the wrong answers. All right. So delta G is the change in government spending, delta Y is the change in output, delta C is the change in consumption, right? There's our national income identity. We leave I and net exports alone. So ultimately, okay, so your multiplier then is right there. Got a high C man, oh yeah, from Gavin.
That's
Kool-Aid Man.
Oh, right. There is no high C man.
I was like, so this is going on YouTube where you're like trying to not break.
My concussion. Wow. All right. So the size of that multiplier depends upon the marginal propensity to consume. So if it's 0.5, the multiplier is 2. If it's 0.75, the multiplier is 4. Following this? Wait, what?
You're plugging in 0.5 to the equation.
Yeah, 1 minus 2.5.
1 minus 0.5 is 0.5. 1 divided by 0.5 is 2.
No, 1 minus 0.9.
Quick maths.
1
It's
not my
minus
specialty.
1.
Okay.
What about,
Can there be negative?
can it not be 1?
It's not 100%.
The
It's
NPC
1.
can never be 1. Is that what you're telling us?
Can be.
Yeah,
No, because
that means
one-
if you
that
get
means
all
you
your
save
extra-
Then there's just no multiplier.
Yeah.
It does the work for you.
Your MPC when you found that $20 in your pocket was 1. You spent it all.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. So it's like, that's why I was just going.
So the greater the marginal propensity to consume, the greater the multiplier effect. You can't spend more than you additionally get.
So then, if
I mean, I suppose you can.
credit.
That's what I was thinking. Is there ever a chance where that'll multiply?
No, the multiplier itself won't ever be greater than 1. Do people do stuff like that? Yes.
I don't understand how you could even think about that, because it's the fraction of extra income, so it's only talking about the extra income you get, so how do you spend more than what you get? Like,
So if I get a raise of $5,000 a year and I go buy a car that's interest pay or that's loan is going to cost me $6,000 a year, is what he's saying.
so then it would be 1 and the other stuff wouldn't be included after that.
Right.
So
Is
you
what I'm
would-
saying to him. All right. So where else does the money multiplier effect get us into, or the multiplier effect? The multiplier effect also plays on the other components of GDP. Okay. A recession overseas. How about a famine overseas or a drought in Africa where we begin exporting large amounts of grain? Okay. All that more money is coming in to the country through our net exports. Due to the recession, they're broke in Europe, and they're not buying any more of our exports. So our net exports decrease. Does a decrease have a multiplier effect? Absolutely. We've talked about this in relationship to the circular flow, right? So they're not buying American-made cars, so American manufacturers cut down on output, which means that they either reduce wages or they completely lay people off, right? So I'm laid off. Not only am I not spending what I used to make, I'm not spending any more, and I'm cutting back, right? If I went out to dinner twice a week, I'm not going out at all. Then the restaurant is seeing a loss, right? It just multiplies more. Okay? Got it? All right. The crowding out effect. Another impact of fiscal policy. First one, multiplier effect. Now the crowding out effect. Fiscal expansions raise the interest rate. An increase in the interest rate does what to investment? It decreases investment. As investment decreases, what happens to aggregate demand? It decreases. So if we had fiscal policy which increased aggregate demand, right? That increased aggregate demand reduces the interest rate, which reduces investment. So if we increase aggregate demand by this much, that increase in interest rate and reduction in investment, because investment is a component of GDP, we're going to see some reduction in that maximum increase of aggregate demand. So fiscal policy is working against itself inherently to some degree. How much? Alright. So the size of the expected increase in aggregate demand ends up being a little smaller than we expected because of the crowding out effect. Especially if that increased government spending happens through acquisition of debt. For instance, boys and girls, let me cook up a scenario. I don't know, let's radically increase our defense budget. At the same time, we decrease our tax revenue. How will we pay for that increased defense spending?
Credit cards.
As a government, how do we pay for that?
China.
We borrow money.
China.
Do you see? I don't have to make up a scenario, you're living in it.
I like when you make fun of it, because it gets funny.
This is too good.
China. China.
You got two Democratic representatives, two folks running for the Democratic nomination. You got Don Bacon running for re-election. Write all three of them a letter. Ask them about this scenario. See what they say.
Our military's actually China, so we just put our flag on.
You call it your gay.
Straight up, juice boxes.